So I'm going to read a story that I just wrote for someone who asked me to do so. So here we go. It was Halloween night and Esther was excited. It was the first one she'd been allowed to go trick-or-treating on. She was 5 years old and dressed in an unfortunate costume that was not of her choosing, but it had been the only way to be allowed out of the house on this sacred night, so Esther had grudgingly agreed. It was a particularly warm night for late October in Vermont. Not that Esther was complaining. The night was full of electric energy that bounced around, much as if the night were excited, as she was. She was clinging to the hand of her 16-year-old brother, who had been more than happy to take his younger sister out for her first night of trick-or-treating. He was dressed up as Dracula, with fake blood and everything. Esther was thrilled by this costume. It was scary, just as Halloween costumes should be. She herself was dressed up in a fluffy bunny costume. It wasn't even a dead bunny. Her mother had insisted, though, and all the candy had been lore enough for Esther to put the costume on. Her brother was carrying a large pillowcase filled nearly to the brim with all the candy they had received on this outing. His pocket was stuffed full of slips of paper with phone numbers from the teenage girls handing out candy for their parents. This had been an unexpected perk for Theseus. Hold on, I lost my place. But he wasn't complaining. He'd probably be able to go on a date with a different girl every night for the rest of the year. He genuinely did just want to take Esther out. He was a good brother and often spent his time watching her. She was a smart little girl, so it was no trouble for him. They often watched scary movies together, and Esther rarely got frightened, even though Theseus himself would sometimes give a startled jump or occasional squeal of fear. Theseus looked down fondly at Esther. "Ready to head home, honey bunny?" Esther smirked up at her older brother, about to reply yes, when her eyes fell on a creepy mansion she'd never noticed before. It was dilapidated, just like the old movies. Her eyes caught Theseus's with a sparkle of mischief in them. He was void of the option to disagree, so he allowed her to pull him along up the long gravel driveway, his heart hammering fiercely against his chest. There was a bucket of candy left on the porch with a sign that said, "Take only one per person, please." The bucket was empty, and before Theseus could stop her, Esther was knocking on the door, tiny fist pounding as if even in the knock she was demanding candy. An ominous sound came from just inside the house, the sound of wood dragging across splintered wood before Theseus could grab Esther and pull her back. A man in full-out pirate garb was standing before them. Only this did not appear to be just a Halloween costume. And then the stories started racing through Theseus' mind, the horror stories. He fought to find his voice, but Esther, ever innocent and far too articulate for her age, was already speaking. "Sorry to bother you, sir. You were out of candy on the porch. This is my first Halloween, so I just wondered if maybe my older brother and I could look around your house instead." The man's smile was grotesque, teeth missing and blackened, others appearing to be wooden. He had a scraggly black beard and black hair that wound its way down to the floor. He wore an eye patch over his left eye, and his right leg was pure wood. He pulled his hat from his head and bent forward as much as his stiff wooden leg would allow. "I suppose that sounds like a fair trade, young madam." The pirate man's voice was thick and deep, and made Theseus's blood curdle in his veins, but he reached for Esther's hand. He couldn't allow her to go in alone. Theseus nodded to him as they passed over the threshold, his heart hammering against his chest. He felt panic seizing him. He had to get them back out of the house. The house was covered in cobwebs, and the wooden floor was destroyed. Hardly any furniture stood in the room they'd entered, but what was there looked like it was centuries old. "I'll tell you what," the pirate man said, from far too close behind Theseus for the teen's liking. "There is a chest of pirate gold from the 17th century just through that door. Each of you may take a coin. If you take more than that, I cannot be held responsible for what will occur. But take only one piece, and you may return to my home next Halloween. It is getting far too late for me to have guests, you see." Theseus was happy, for the owl nodded. Esther held out her tiny hand to the pirate man to shake on it. "I cannot shake your hand, little missy, not now, but I promise if you do as I say, next Halloween you will have your handshake." Esther nodded curtly, displaying again the actions of a much older person. She pulled Theseus along to the room the pirate man had pointed at, and instantly saw the gold he'd been speaking of. She reached her tiny hand into the chest and pulled out a coin. Theseus followed suit and put his in the pocket he had his mother sew into the cape on a whim. Esther also had a tiny pocket, and she thrust the coin into it and patted it as if to ensure its safety. The pirate man appeared and pointed towards the door. "You'll have to be on your way now, I am afraid," he said, motioning to the door, and the children both nodded to him, exiting the premises quickly. Theseus lifted Esther up in one arm and walked home as quickly as possible. He couldn't shake the odd feeling the coin house pirate man had given him, and he didn't want to waste time getting back to the safety of their home.